Welcome, Campfire Crew. Let's get it on. Hotel Creeper, submitted by NB. Thanks for telling my Uber horror story in Volume 50. This next story is told from the perspective of a friend of mine I used to work with at a Holiday Inn. Let me start out with my name. It's Sarah, and at the time I was 35 years old working the night audit for a hotel in northern Georgia. I've worked there for 3 years and loved my job, especially working nights. As a night audit, you see all kinds of crazy shit, and trust me, I've seen it all. However, this one night changed it all for me. A little backstory before I get to that. The front desk manager at the time was a middle-aged woman named Kathy. She is a devout Christian and has a soft spot for the homeless. We had this regular homeless man that came by named Patrick, and he was a tall, skinny black man, just to give you a description. At first, I also liked Patrick, and he would come in during my evening shifts, and we would talk, and I would let him hang out for a bit. After a while, though, he became very aggressive about his panhandling in the parking lot for second shift. Customers were constantly complaining, and we were receiving bad reviews because of it. So, on to the horrific night. I was at work like usual, and I received a complaint from a customer walking into the hotel, saying there was a panhandler in the parking lot. Of course, it was Patrick. I assured the customer that I would take care of it, and I went from behind my desk and made my way outside to the parking lot and was walking the area. Yeah, I know it's very stupid and dangerous for a female to be doing this, but I am trained in hand-to-hand combat and some weaponry. I was continuing my walk when all of a sudden I was snatched up from behind, and sure enough, it was Patrick. Instinct kicked in, and I flung my head back as hard as I could and connected with Patrick's nose. He released me and was cursing on the ground. I ran so fast that I came out of my slip-on shoes. I ran back in, locked the front doors, and dialed 911, shaking, and my head was racing so freaking bad I thought I would pass out. The police officer arrived, and I came outside and told him everything, and he saw how freaked out I was. He assured me, "Don't worry, this guy will resist." He was the coolest police officer I'd ever met. After the incident, I took some time off and was going to find another job. However, I still ended up working there for another year, and our manager finally hired a security guard for the overnight shift. People around town started telling me shortly after my encounter they saw Patrick around the local gas station, and he had a huge bandage on his nose. So, Patrick, first off, you can go to hell, and secondly, let's never meet again. One Good Monster Deserves Another, submitted by SMACG4. My first memories as a child were of being abused, and those images are burned into my memory for life. The abuse I suffered continued late into my childhood, and my pleas of help to my mother and father went unheeded, as they could not believe that a family member so close to them could do such unspeakable things to their child. The very mention of the topic brought on vicious arguments between my parents, until they finally divorced when I was 12. For a very long time, I felt I was the cause of their separation. I'm still not sure. When they separated, at least there was some peace in the house, but that was not to last. Soon my mother found out that her life was far more fun without my father, and she began drinking, taking drugs, and partying all night with a bunch of local bikers. But she had one small problem: me. She started antagonizing me and calling me retarded repeatedly because I was crying for my father. Of course, as a child, I was very defensive of my father, and when I would say that I loved him, she would start to hit me until she would get a good punch or a kick in. I'd be on the floor crying. Finally, I snapped, and when I pushed my mother away while she was screaming at how I should have been drowned at birth, she got all calm and picked up the phone. Little did I know, things were about to get worse. My mother called her family and told them that I had hit her and that she could not cope with an abusive child. She told me to pack my things as I was going to stay with her family for 2 weeks to settle down. But I had my suspicions that she just wanted her bratty kid out of the way. So, I found myself on a plane, alone at 12 years old, headed to the very house where my abuser lived, and not for a 2-week stay, but for 2 freaking years. To my eternal horror and shame, I found that I had to sleep in my abuser's old bed and wear my abuser's old hand-me-down clothing. Then the grooming began again, with my abuser offering me special gifts, a bit of extra cash, and even drugs. I was on my own, and there was no one to protect me or believe me, so I fought off the playful wrestling and ignored the lewd comments until the threats started, and the attempts to playfully wrestle became painful escapes for my abuser. I was alone in a town where everyone loved my abuser, and I was going insane trying to cope. Enter the hero. My father came to town and took me away from all that madness. The problem was, he could not take away the madness that had grown inside me. I had 3 good years of peace and happiness with my father, going to bike shows, shooting guns, helping build cars, and doing kid stuff with him. Unfortunately, though, he could do nothing against my abuser. He told me that my mother's side of the family were members of some secret boys' club with fancy rings and secret handshakes, and that he could not speak against them for fear of his life. All the time, I just thought they were some type of gang, and I didn't really understand what he said. I really tried to start a new life with my dad, but troubled teens will be troubled teens, and my dad and I parted ways when I dropped out of school. I did my best, but I was traumatized before anyone knew what PTSD was, and it led me into making some really bad decisions that landed me in jail in a series of group homes where I suffered further abuses. As an adult, I drifted in and out of relationships for years, always wondering why they blew up in my face so spectacularly, and why I had never had any good friendships with any of my ex-girlfriends afterwards. Women just seemed to hate me, I thought. One girlfriend had attacked me with a knife, another dumped me when I told her I loved her, and yet another ripped my heart to pieces when I asked her to marry me. After so many failures and frustrations, I just gave up on ever finding some measure of happiness with a woman and set about living the best I could alone. I bought a small house and devoted myself to trying to help people in hopes of finding a more platonic love and some measure of self-respect. I taught music and worked as a repairman for many years, and I really enjoyed being the guy who could fix anything. In some small way, I looked at myself as a small hero when I could walk into a hostile mess and walk out with everyone happy. But I still felt an emptiness in my heart. About 12 years ago, a precious bundle of joy arrived in my arms in the form of a 5-week-old pit bull puppy. The puppy was a gift from one of my oldest friends, Nigel, whose dog I had rescued a couple of years ago. My puppy looked like a little mouse with tiger stripes all over his body, and the crest of his chest formed a white T, and he had white spots on the bottoms of all 4 paws that you could see flash when he ran. This was my first dog ever, and I had planned in advance to have several months off work so I could train him properly. Not having a job forced me to find ways to supplement my income, as now I had an extra ravenous mouth to feed. After a short time, I found that I could make decent income working from home teaching music and doing odd jobs. And during that time, I found out just how smart this puppy was. While I thought I was training him, he was actually training me. I developed a certain anxiety about leaving him alone when I was returning to a regular job and what damage he could do to my house. So I decided to continue working from home, fully realizing that my puppy had trained me to stay. I was willing to forgive him for this, as he taught me how to love again, too. Thus began a series of adventures between a boy and his dog that I could write volumes about. Never during these happy years did I suspect that my childhood abuser still had me in his grip, and there was never going to be an easy way to escape. This is when I met Colette. Colette was a sweet girl who just happened to be the little sister of an old acquaintance of mine, Rick. She had that precocious little sister attitude, and I just knew she had terrorized her older brother to tears when they were younger. She had a voice that could make a drunken bagpiper cringe, and a way of talking so fast that everything became one word. I guess it was an effective way for her to get attention in a room full of people, away from her older brother. She also had this cute way of acting when she lost an argument or got caught in a fib. She would become calm, and for a while her voice would be normal instead of the usual chimpanzee screeches. I think her brother would torment her just so she would settle down and stop acting like a weasel on Red Bull just for a few minutes. Unfortunately, I think her competition with her brother was what made her look at every man in the room as a challenge to be conquered. On our first date, I caught her staring at me over a bowl of Vietnamese food, and I could see her calculating something in her head. Unfortunately, I didn't realize at the time she was a predator, and she was sizing me up as prey. Colette had developed some fearsome hunting assets that supplemented her average looks, and soon she learned that she could show those assets off and get the attention of all the men in the room without ever having to learn any hunting etiquette. Now I found myself hypnotized by those very same assets, and I thought, what the hey, I'm an older guy with time on my hands and an empty nest. Why not invite her into my house? Oh boy, what a horror show that turned out to be. Colette brought her boyfriend, Brian, to our second date, and I watched as she sat beside me on the couch and left him to sit in a chair across the room while she emasculated the poor guy by fawning all over me and rubbing my leg right in front of him. I should have realized on the spot that she was a predator with no conscience or sense of empathy, but I got suckered by the sad tale she told me about how she had been abused in her first love and the father of her child, Joey. So I watched poor Brian wither under her assault on his ego and masculinity until he departed from Colette's life. Then she took me to the bedroom and into her clutches. I settled down to 2 years of relative bliss with Colette as long as I fed her liquor and drugs while letting her have her homosexual friend come over to get drunk and scream at each other. Colette said she wanted to have a child with me, and since I had an empty nest to fill, I ignored her weird comments about cannibalism, her fetish for talking about sex with dogs, and the fact that she used nearly everything in the house to pleasure herself. But when she told me that her and her older brother had been abused by an older family member, I took an interest as it was a topic I knew a lot about firsthand, unfortunately. I suggested that she read Freud's opinion on how adult sexuality is formed based on the earliest sexual experiences, and that her need to smash and destroy all men before her was the result of her first sexual experiences with her brother. I told her that any strong man that she met now represented her brother, and she needed to conquer them at all costs. As expected, that didn't go very well, and I was assaulted by constant accusations of wanting to sleep with my sister. I mean, talk about striking an insecure nerve in Colette's psyche. Whoops. I think that one planted the seeds of doom for our pretend relationship. She had realized that I was too smart for her, and she could never conquer me or win at any of the silly little games she played to test me. I told her that the men in her life had probably abused her because she would allow them to take any initiative in the relationship, because all she wanted them to do was shut up, get drunk, and shmoo-shmoo. Well, that was it, and we were done. So I went back to what I loved before I met Colette, teaching music and having fun with my tiger-striped pit bull. I tutored a good friend and helped her earn her paramedic ticket. I taught another friend to play the bagpipes, and I taught my dog some new tricks. Too bad I didn't learn anything because I was about to meet a monster. About 2 years ago, my old friend Nigel brought his 23-year-old son to meet me. Immediately, my first impression was that the kid gave me this creepy Buffalo Bill vibe with his spidery body and sickly complexion. I had heard about how his father had tried to rescue his son from his mother's side of the family for years, and the story touched my heart as I could relate to my own childhood experiences. Nigel told me his son, who I will call Mud, had been pulled out of the northern native community because he had run afoul of just about everyone over meth, cocaine, MDMA, and just about anything he could smoke, inject, or swallow. Nigel asked me to let the kid stay with me and help him clean up before he got AIDS or got murdered for being, well, himself. So I thought to myself, I could fix just about anything. What I should have remembered is that you just can't fix stupid. But Nigel said he was a good worker and that he could work off the $4,000 in debt Nigel had owed me for years. So I took the kid in and did my best to help him. So a couple of years went by, and the kid did a good job of convincing me that he was clean, though I had my suspicions that he wasn't. Mud had this little buddy he met at work named Kyle, who would come over and get blackout drunk and sleep over in Mud's room, and I started to wonder if Kyle was supplying Mud with cocaine. The problem was that when they were having a sleepover, I knew the only place to sleep in his room was a tiny single bed, and I did not want to bust them doing something other than cocaine. One night, I got a really creepy vibe from them as Mud and Kyle were having a few too many drinks, and Mud started to jones hard for cocaine. His buddy Kyle kept refusing to get any more, and Mud got really dark and started demanding it from Kyle. Now, I knew Mud had been lying about being clean, but he was too drunk and violent at the time for me to effectively confront him about it. I tried to calm Mud down and get him to go to bed, but it was no use. He kept demanding cocaine. Kyle poured him almost an entire bottle of rum in a glass and kept yelling at him until Mud drank the whole thing. I thought this would knock the kid out, and it seemed to work as the two went downstairs for their sleepover. Not 20 minutes later, while I was outside of my house for a smoke in the cool of the night, Kyle came running out of the house, half-dressed, looking wild-eyed and terrified. I stood on the sidewalk with him in front of my house and asked him what was going on. At that moment, Mud exploded out of the front door of my house, dressed only in sweatpants. Kyle cringed behind me and said, "He's trying to stab me." I didn't see Mud with any kind of knife, so I smirked and thought it was a homosexual thing. But the fear in Kyle was real, and I could smell it pouring out of his sweaty body. When Mud saw Kyle hiding behind me, he gave me a look that sent a chill up my spine that I will remember to the grave. Mud's eyes seemed to be completely black, and his body looked like rage and hate clothed in sallow, sickly skin. Mud lunged forward, muttering insanely while staring hatefully at us, then suddenly veered off and stormed off down the street, screaming obscenities at the top of his lungs. I stayed with Kyle until some of his friends came and drove him off, and that was the last time I saw the poor guy. I didn't think too much more on it, as I was really tired and a little bit tipsy myself. Mud wandered in some hours later while I was sleeping and dreaming about not having to apologize to the neighbors every 2 weeks when this idiot got drunk and terrorized the neighborhood. For fuck's sake, I was thinking Mud was going to pound on their doors demanding they buy him crack the next time he got drunk. There were some intervals of tranquility, though. Every so often, Mud would go to see his ex-girlfriend, ex-dealer Tina, to visit with her and his infant child for the weekend. Tina and Mud had had a bad relationship in the past, and she'd been scared to death by Mud when they lived together up north, so she had fled to another province to hide from him. Mud found her and threatened to have her child taken away if she did not return and allow him visits. She complied, and this seemed to mollify Mud for a bit, and he began to visit, and eventually they started dating again. It was a hot and sunny day in early August when Mud was getting ready for one of his visits to Tina, when I noticed that my dog was starting to get sick. He lost control of his bladder and peed all over the front porch. Mud scolded him, but I was really concerned for his health as his urine was greenish, full of pus, and extremely vile-smelling. Mud left for his visit, and I got busy with trying to find out what I could do to help my pup, as I suspected that he had a bladder or kidney infection. Over the next few days, my dog's condition worsened, to the point where he couldn't walk, and I had to carry him out to the front yard to pee and take a crap. I was too concerned with my dog to notice that Mud had taken all of his belongings with him, and he had skipped out on me, owing several months' rent. Anyway, I looked on the internet for any way to help my ailing pet. I gave him apple cider vinegar, switched him to wet food, and gave him what healing herbs I had around the house, but nothing seemed to help. My poor dog was laying on the couch with me, unable to lift his head, while I comforted him, spoon-fed him water and honey, preparing for the worst. Then a miracle happened. He lifted his head up, licked my hand, and tried to drink from the bowl of honey water I was holding. I was ecstatic. I had my beloved pet back. I fussed over him for a few days, continuing to give him the best care that I could, and his condition improved to the point where I didn't have to carry him out to the front, and now he wanted to go out in the backyard where he usually played and did his business. The next day, he died. About a month after my tiger-striped pup died, I got the phone call I didn't want to hear. It was Mud on the other end, and he was crying and saying it was over. He'd done something terrible to himself, and how I should just kill him. Instinctively, I asked him if he had hurt his child, and he cried and cried before groaning out a feeble, "No," and started begging for my help. When he came back to my house, it took 3 days of him crying about how he screwed his whole life up before I finally got him to tell me what happened. He told me he had punched a guy who had accosted Tina, and that he was now wanted by the police for assault. I took him to a lawyer and had him turn himself into the police, where he was arrested. The judge sentenced him to 1 year probation and 3 months house arrest. In my house. Oh Lord, why did they punish me for this? Unfortunately, I was soon to find out what punishment really is, because Colette walked back into my life. The past 4 years had not been kind to Colette. Her face had lost the girlish good looks, and her hair looked more appropriate on a fascist Richard Spencer than on any of the fairer sex, though it did match the swastika tattoos she had recently acquired. She plopped down on the couch beside me, rubbed my leg like old times, and told me that she was sorry to see that my dog had passed away, and that she wanted to comfort me, as she knew how much my little guy meant. My whole day brightened as I thought maybe Colette had matured, and that possibly we could have some measure of friendship between us, instead of the hatred the other exes had shown me in the past. I told her that I was more concerned about my dad. I had recently found out that he was suffering from an abdominal aortic aneurysm, which had turned over 6 inches of the main blood vessel from his heart into a balloon, and it could pop at any moment, killing him instantly. She just smiled at me and said that she wanted to play video games and kid like the old times, and how she didn't want me to be alone during this time. I felt a tear of joy forming in my eye, but alas, I was not alone. Mud came sliming his way up from the basement, and the old patterns of Colette's behavior began again. First the embarrassing stories started, then the mocking and the insults as Colette screeched in celebration of her total victory over all mankind. She showed me pictures of some of her recent 35 male victims and talked about how they were hardcore drug users. As she began fawning over Mud, what little of my heart I had saved for over the years of abuse died then and there. Sure enough, over the next few days, Colette and Mud began to disappear around the same time. I had told both of them not to do anything sleazy in my house, but they were both selfish, greedy monsters, and I knew what to do. I decided to become the predator, and all the training my dad had given me when I was a kid started to kick in as I set my trap. When the trap was sprung, the lying and squealing from these pigs would just not stop, but I would not relent as the prey was firmly in my jaws now. I bit down hard and cracked the bones of every lie they told me and chewed their hearts to pieces. When it was over and the truth was all known, Mud fled like a coward, leaving his so-called beloved swine to face my wrath alone. Colette spent her efforts between vulgarly spitting in my face and then wiping it off, saying, "Sorry, I didn't want to hurt you," in an effort to keep the door of my now non-existent heart open, in hopes of claiming victory in a battle she can never win. But the shattered and smoking ruins I had created out of these pigs was not enough for me. My house now cleared of the stain of Mud, I had then started to expose all the lies by searching the contents of his room, and that's when the first horror set in. All my hunches were right. Junkie gear was everywhere among the rotting plates of food in his room. The floor was hidden by layers of garbage and dirty clothes, and I'd almost had a heart attack when I stepped on a used needle. Luckily, it did not penetrate my shoe. The foulest of all was the bloody, feces-stained, ripped condom I found. I mean, no man should have to clean that out of their house. Then I hit the second horror. Mud's arrest records. Guess what? It did not contain the name of the man he assaulted. It contained the name of the woman he assaulted. Tina. That scumbag Mud had gotten drunk and talked with pleasure about the power he felt from that assault. I didn't think it was sick at the time because I had assumed that he had hit a man and not the mother of his child. But he had smashed in the face of a tiny woman who was permanently disabled and unable to defend herself or her child from Mud's rage. I felt sick and betrayed. I had defended this piece of shit, and all the while he had been lying to me. A debt of honor needed to be paid, and these people need to learn what it is like to be defenseless. So I followed my hunch back to the source and called Nigel about his son's sexual history. He confirmed my suspicions, and then I had the great satisfaction of telling Colette that she had screwed a bisexual IV drug user with hepatitis. At least now she can't spread her poison to anyone else or destroy any men for at least the next 2 months, while she's waiting to see how many diseases she's contracted from screwing this junkie. The next morning, the final horror was revealed. I searched my backyard and found the half-empty bottle of antifreeze. A bottle of antifreeze that had no business being anywhere other than in the cupboard in my house. A bottle of antifreeze with a small hole punched in it, and the marks of where my once beautiful pup had chewed around the hole. A bottle of antifreeze Mud had put there when he thought he was never coming back. The next day, I hunted Mud down at the court-ordered anger management course he was ironically taking, and proceeded to smash his face into a pulp. I felt sublime joy in my heart as my fist repeatedly smashed into his vile face, and it was at this time that I realized the skeletal grip of my childhood abuser had slipped from my throat. In a rush, it came to me that all my life I had been attracted to abusive people. Now that I understood the source of my horror, my transformation was complete, and I had become the lion I always imagined myself to be. Now I'm with the people who I love and who love me. I'm with my father in the time of his need. But one thing is troubling me. The question nagging at the back of my mind as I think to myself, am I the monster now? I guess the best answer to that question is, maybe one good monster deserves another. Something Strange Lives Near My House by Anonymous Guy. So, this all started nearly a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, actually. I had some friends over at my house, and school had just started, and we decided we wanted to have a final chill session before school got too intense. We hung out together and played some on our computers till my parents went to bed, and then we snuck out. We went on a little adventure, smoked some weed, and after a few hours, we went on our way back home. We walked on the sidewalk of a big road, and this sidewalk has the road on one side and a fence on the other. The fence is pretty tall, maybe 10 feet, and it's barbed wire, and on the other side is just some really dense vegetation. While walking, I started hearing some twigs snap and leaves rustling in the distance. I asked my friends if they heard it, and they all said yeah, but it was probably just a squirrel, a really reasonable assumption. I ignored it, but the rustling started getting closer and closer. We could all hear it, and the rustling sounded as if something big was walking in the same direction as us. At this point, we were a bit unsettled, but we really weren't paying too much thought to it, since there is a huge fence between us, and realistically, what really could it be out there? After a minute of the rustling being maybe 20 feet away, I can't be accurate about it, but I'm just guessing on what it sounded like, it stopped. We kept on walking until suddenly the rustling was definitely no more than 5 feet away from the fence, and it was moving fast and sounded as big as a person. We could see the trees and bushes shake, but we couldn't see whatever the thing was. We got freaked out and ran to the other side of the road, not caring if there were any cars coming. Thankfully, there weren't. After a while, though, we just mutually agreed that that was weird and continued on doing what teenagers do until we went to bed. This was around 1 a.m. A couple of weeks after, I was hanging out with one of those 3 friends that I had had over that night. We did the same routine, this time sober, snuck out at night, and went on an adventure. As we were walking back home, we hit the start of the fence where that weird rustling happened. I told him, "Remember that time we heard the weird rustling sound? What do you think that could have been?" He says, "We were all pretty high. I mean, maybe it wasn't even real. Still kind of weird how we all heard the same thing, though." And in that moment exactly, I heard the most spine-chilling, inhuman shriek I have ever heard, literally coming from maybe a meter away from the fence. Our faces went pale, and we absolutely bolted. The cry we heard could not have been anything human or animal. There are coyotes in my area, but I've listened to recordings of their cries, and it wasn't anything like that. I don't know what this thing is, but I'm absolutely terrified to go anywhere near there again. A Guy Named Mitch, submitted by Tina. After I graduated with a degree in communications, specifically public relations, I took a job out of state. As a matter of fact, I moved halfway across the states to take a job, as there were none in the area that I lived. I know, real bright. Get a job in a field that is not available in the town you're living in. Anyway, I had a blast, was living in New York for this job, and it didn't pay that much, but I got a lot of experience and met a lot of really cool people, and still have a lot of good friends that live there. However, after 3 years of working at this agency, I heard about a position from my parents with a local supermarket chain back home. They were looking for someone with my skills to work in their marketing department. The pay was a little bit higher, but in the Midwest, that kind of money goes a heck of a lot farther out there than it does in a place like New York City. I jumped at the chance and applied, and was lucky enough to have a friend who worked in management there. I was hoping I'd be a shoo-in. I did get a call for an interview and took vacation time from my current job and went back home, hoping that this prospect would work out and I could make a living back home. Without going into all the details, that's exactly what happened. I was hired, I quit my job, said goodbyes to my friends, and went back to my hometown. It was a cool job, but frankly the supermarket world is not as exciting as the ad agency world, and the clients that I worked with at my other job. But I didn't care. It was cool meeting all the people, and a lot of the programs that we did were focused on the community. After about a year and a half, my boss decided to quit, and I was chosen to replace her. So, within a short while, I was now the main spokesperson for this chain. At least as far as community events went, I would prepare a lot of the material for the organization, the president and the board of directors, but they would always wheel me out to deal with the media when they didn't want to, which was most of the time. So because of this, I appeared in local newspapers as well as local television stations when we were promoting special events or sponsorships for community events. This wasn't all the time, but it was at least every other month on TV. I tried to stay out of our promotional photos as much as possible, just like every good PR person does. However, after we launched a new partnership with a charitable organization and their upcoming gala, I led a small press conference in one of our stores before turning it over to the president of the company. This was our standard protocol. I would lay things out, set up the general statement, and then the president would make the official announcement, usually with an official from the other organization we were working with. So this press conference was just like any others that we had ever done. I stood off to the side to let the bigwigs do their thing, snapping pictures with my phone, and getting them ready to go out on social media. That's when I noticed something that might have been sitting in the back of my mind for quite some time. The last few community events we held, there was this guy that was always there participating. I said it was in the back of my mind because lots of people show up at these things to volunteer or just be a part of it, but he had the whitest teeth I had ever seen, and I think that's what made him stick out. He was a pretty good-looking guy, so I didn't have that stupid notion that a lot of people do that homeless-looking people at hangout events like this are there to cause trouble or to walk off with as much free stuff as they can get. I know that sounds rude, but a lot of people in my organization looked at those folks that way, and quite frankly, we had to be on the lookout for them, as while most of them were harmless, sometimes a few were not, and would not only take the freebies, but also attempt to steal anything else they could get their hands on. So I saw this guy and didn't really do anything about it. I just kept doing what I was doing. But every once in a while, I would kind of glance over out of the side of my eyes, if you know what I mean. I couldn't help but notice that he was just staring at me. So we're wrapping things up, and I have to go to arrange for one-on-ones with the reporters and my president and the CEO of the other company. Most everybody else is either mingling and chatting for a minute before taking off, and I don't see the guy when I glance around as I was working. Finally, everyone left, the event was over, and I'm helping to clean up the things that we had brought out for the festival look. I felt someone behind me, and lo and behold, it's this guy. He's like 2 feet behind me and asks if I need any help. I turn around and take a step back, and then apologize and tell him, no, I've got it, but I appreciate it, and thanks for coming. I turned to go back to doing what I was doing, but he walked around in front of me and said, "My name's Mitch." I look at him for a second and say, "Oh, hi Mitch. Again, thanks for coming." He just looks at me and says, "You're Tina, right? I recognize you from TV." I laugh and say, yeah, I've been on TV a couple of times. He says, "You're not from around here, are you?" And I say, "Actually, I am from here, but I did spend some time away from town." Now I'm thinking to myself, why am I telling him any of this stuff? He's a complete stranger. He doesn't say anything for a few seconds as I was still taking down some streamers and throwing all of our extra PR stuff in a box. "Do you have a boyfriend?" he asks, and I say, "Well, Mitch, I'm not trying to be mean, but that's really none of your business." And he says, "I'm sorry, I just wanted to ask you out for a coffee or a drink sometime." I told him that I was flattered, but I was really busy, and I didn't really have time for much social stuff in my life right now. He looks at me with these weird eyes and those giant white teeth, and says, "So you don't have a boyfriend?" And before I can respond, he just says, "Well, see you around. It was nice meeting you, Tina." He walked away, and I just stood there mulling over what the hell that meant. At the time, I just thought he was going to show up at more events in the future, but I was very, very wrong. The assistant in the marketing department was standing there, and I'll call him Jeremy, and he says, "Oh my God, that was awkward." I nodded and said, "Yeah," and he responded, "Well, you pretty girls attract all the weirdos," and started laughing. I laughed too, punched him in the arm lightly, and said, "Man, give me a break." Life went on, and I didn't think about Mitch because I was so busy with other things, and in fact, I had met a new guy and was in the beginnings of a relationship with him. It was still really early, only a couple of weeks in, so nothing super serious, but we did enjoy going out and having a good time. My little town doesn't have too much in the way of entertainment other than the usual stuff most towns have. A small mall, a movie theater, a couple of bars, but nothing that's like upscale, like in New York. Nowhere in any flyover state is anything like a big city, and the biggest city closest to us was about 20 miles away. Anyway, this new guy, I'll call him Greg, was really cool. In the back of my mind, I really wanted to move the relationship forward, and after a month or so, we were still taking it slow. I guess I was okay with that too, in retrospect. One night, we went to the city for dinner and drinks with some friends. Mostly my friends, as Greg was not from my hometown and really didn't know anybody. We had fun dancing, and everyone was getting to know Greg, and during a funny dance session on the dance floor, I looked into a mirror that was on the wall and stopped dancing immediately. And the reflection at the edge of the dance floor was Mitch. I mean, what are the odds of seeing that guy way out here, away from our town? I got off the dance floor and Greg followed me, and I tried to point Mitch out and tell him the weird things that he had said to me at that press conference. Greg actually said, "Well, that wasn't really that weird, but at the same time, it wasn't Captain Smooth either. Maybe he's just an awkward guy and didn't know how to talk to you." I agreed, and we had another beer and just kept talking with our friends before it was starting to close. We knew he had to drive home, and Greg had been doing his best to not get too messed up as he was driving. We got out to his car, and he let me in on the passenger side, got in the driver's side, and looked over at me, and then kind of reeled back a little bit and hit his head on the window behind him. I looked at him and said, "What?" Turn around, and right in my window is the smiling face of Mitch. He gives the roll down the window motion, which is funny that people still do that, as I haven't seen a car like that with a crank handle for the window in a long time. I suppose that looks funny now, but at the time I remember thinking, what the hell is he doing? I tell Greg to just get out, and he does. He says he can still see Mitch standing in the parking lot in his rearview mirror. We got back on the highway and headed for home. Now we started laughing about it, and I said, "I told you that guy was weird," and now finally Greg agreed. We were just listening to music and talking about what we wanted to do the following weekend, when a vehicle came up behind us with its brights on. It got right on our ass and filled our car with bright light, and then it started honking his horn, and Greg said, "Oh shit, what's this all about?" He drove this bright yellow Camaro and told me to hold on. It was pretty straight sailing all the way back to town, so he felt confident that he could go fast, and he did. That car could fly. We soon outdistanced whoever was behind us, and the lights faded, and after about 2 miles we didn't see them at all. I asked aloud, "Do you think that could have been Mitch?" And Greg said maybe, but how could we tell? The rest of the evening was uneventful, and the next couple of weeks were just full of work and doing fun stuff on the weekends with Greg. That's when Greg got an email at work that just had in all capital letters, "Stay away from her." He didn't tell anyone at work, he just showed it to me, and I told him that he probably should tell somebody, even though it might be nothing. He said I was jumping to conclusions, but I thought it was odd. At any rate, he did, and someone pinged the IP from where it came, and one of the tech nerds narrowed it down and said it came from our town public library. Right after that, I started getting strange texts on my phone. It was from a number I didn't know, and it was just a lot of gibberish like word salad. Nothing made any sense, just a bunch of random words. I never responded and finally blocked the number, but it didn't matter because the same thing started to happen from a different number. The day after I blocked both numbers, I was at one of our stores looking to scout out cooler sections for a trade publication that wanted to take some beauty shots for an article they were writing. I was just writing notes and walking around and looking at things we would probably have to move for the shots to come off well, when I felt a hand on my shoulder. It took me by surprise, so I turned around to look into the face of Mitch. He just says, "Hi, Tina," It's been a while. Haven't seen you on TV. I just look at him dumbfounded and say, yeah, I haven't really needed to do that in a while. And I immediately turned around and started working again, but I was also walking away from him. He followed me and kept trying to talk to me, and finally I just turned around and said, Mitch, I'm working. You're gonna have to go away. That was really blunt and forceful. He just said, okay, I'll see you around. Turned and walked away. Now I was really weirded out. I went into the manager's office and called Greg. I told him that Mitch had just shown up, and he asked if I was okay, and I said I didn't really do anything, but it was just giving me the creeps. This was towards the end of the day, so Greg said he'd pick me up and we could go get a bite at one of our local Greasy Spoons. The store manager overheard me and asked what had gone wrong. I told him nothing and that things were going to be really awesome with this photo shoot, changing the subject. He said, no, who's Mitch? So I told him about how this guy had said something weird to me a couple of months back, showed up downtown, and then just showed up in the store here. He asked me, how could he possibly know you would have been here? And I said, I never thought of that. He told me he wasn't trying to freak me out, but I told him it was okay. And he said, hang on a second, and went to the video camera system we have for loss prevention. He started zooming through some of the tapes and said, isn't this your car? And I said, yeah. On the video, a car pulled up next to mine, and guess who gets out? Mitch. He fast-forwards the tape, and it shows Mitch stopping at my car, trying all the door handles, then leaving a piece of paper under my wiper blade. Then he got into his car and drove away. And I must say, I don't know what he did for a living, but he had a very, very nice Jaguar. The manager told me to stay put and went outside to my car, and came back with a little envelope. He handed it to me, and I opened it. It had song lyrics in it that we had to look up on the internet. It was a song by John Waite called Missing You. I guess he was big in the 80s or something. I had never heard of him. At this point, I thought maybe I should talk to somebody with the police because this started to get really odd, and I didn't want anything to be creepy like all the shows that I watch on TV. By now the red flags were there and the warning signs, but he had really done nothing to hurt me. Greg got to the store. We showed him the tape and the note, and he said we probably ought to save that, but I think going to the police is probably overkill at this point. It took me a few minutes to agree with him, but it wouldn't be long before we did go to the police. The following week, I did have to go back on TV to promote an event. It was extremely early in the morning, one of those morning shows, and I had to be at the station at about 10 to 6. I did the show, and thought I was going to stop for a terribly unhealthy breakfast at a coffee shop before I headed back to work. When I got out to the parking lot, I didn't notice it because it was parked on the side of the station, but there was a black Jaguar. I did notice it as soon as I got back onto the road in the dim light of dawn, though. I was driving down this pretty deserted road to get back onto a main road where I knew there was an open coffee shop, and I was also trying to one-hand dial Greg. As I was looking down at my phone, I didn't notice that the black Jaguar was now alongside me, and then pulled ahead, and I barely slammed on my brakes enough to not slam into it. Out pops Mitch, who runs around to the side of my car and starts banging on the window, asking if I got his note. I don't know what to say except scream out and yell, "Get away from me!" He tried opening my door, but obviously couldn't, so he ran around to the other side and tried that door. During this time, I'm screaming my head off and not reacting the way that I should. He keeps asking if I got the note. Did you get the note? Did you get the note? Finally, my senses came back. I dialed 911, jammed my car in reverse, and hit the gas as he jumped onto the hood of my car and started pounding on the windshield, screaming for me to stop. At one point, he actually formed a crack in my windshield, and I could see that his hand was bleeding. He started screaming that he loved me and we were supposed to be together, and I'm screaming my head off too, realizing I can't keep going backwards forever, and it's getting dangerous because every time I look at him and then I look back, I'm starting to swerve like I can't keep doing this. So I slowed down, put it into drive, and started to speed up, but not so much as to hurt him because I didn't want to get in any trouble. I can hear the 911 operator from the speaker on my phone, and I'm desperately trying to jab at the speakerphone function. I finally get it to work, and I start screaming about this man who is punching my windshield and not telling the woman on the other end where I am or listening to any of the questions she's asking me. At this point, I take a chance and start swerving side to side to try to shake him off. And eventually it works because he screams one more time, "We're gonna be together!" I took off down the road, and in my rear view mirror saw him running for his car. I hit the main road and just started blasting away, trying to tell the 911 operator where I was and what had happened. I pulled down the first side street I came to, then pulled into someone's driveway right into their backyard. I figured Mitch would not be able to find me there. The guy came out of the house asking what the hell did I think I was doing, and I told him I was on the phone with 911, and he's looking at me like, "What the hell is your problem?" And I just scream out, "What is this address?" He finally tells me, and I tell the 911 operator where I am. She tells me to stay put. The owner of this house just kept asking if everything was okay, and I kept saying, "No, it's not okay, but I'm sorry I'm here." Finally, 2 police cars pulled up, and the officers started talking to me about what had happened. Obviously, they could see the windshield was damaged, and there were blood smears on it. I told them all about Mitch and all the weird stuff that had been happening, and they took everything down and then told me I should call my husband, boyfriend, or parents to come get me, as they were going to take my car to do a deeper dive into who might have been on top of the hood. They told me to come down to the station with them first and fill out a statement, and I had to do a whole bunch of paperwork and answer a whole bunch of questions. It was about 3 hours later when I could finally leave, and I remembered then that I had never even called into work. Funny how the mind works that way. My parents and Greg all came to get me, and we went back to my parents' place. A little while later, the police called my cell phone and asked if they could see the original note that Mitch had written to me, and I told them that I was at my parents', but it was at my apartment, and I could meet them there if they needed it right away. I didn't care at that point. I just wanted Mitch locked up or whatever they could do to him, because at this point I was scared. Greg drove me back to my apartment, and there was a detective waiting there for us in his car. When we got out, he did too and introduced himself. I had not met him earlier. I went to my apartment and unlocked the door and said, "I'll be right back. The note is in my room." Greg said that he needed to use the bathroom and he'd be right back too. As I was getting the note, I heard Greg yell out, "What the fuck?" and the door of the bathroom slammed shut. He yelled for the detective and said, "He's in there, he's in there." The detective said, "Who?" and Greg said, "Who the fuck do you think? Mitch is in the bathroom." The detective said to step away, went to the door, knocked on it, and said, "Mitch, if you're in there, I'm going to open this door and you're going to come out with your hands above your head, and you're going to do exactly what I say." There was no sound coming from the bathroom, and the detective repeated, "I want you to turn your back to the door, put your hands on top of your head, and walk backwards when you hear the door open." This time there was a little shuffling noise, and the detective, with his gun drawn, slowly opened the door, and out came Mitch, his hand all bloody. There was blood all over my sink, shower curtain, and in the tub. The detective got Mitch into handcuffs and got on his cell phone to call for an additional car. He took me outside, and as he walked by me, Mitch said, "This isn't supposed to happen." Well, as you can imagine, there was a lot more to do at the police station. More paperwork, more questions, and we got some answers right away. Mitch was a trust fund kid who was living in his parents' house after they had passed away and left everything to him. He didn't have a job. He didn't have anything in his life other than some expensive cars and a big house full of the latest toys any 25-year-old would want. Tons of stereo equipment, big screen TVs, pool table, all that stuff. Turns out, he was pretty mental. He had some serious issues that only got compounded when his parents died. He'd been living on his own since he was 19 years old and had no family and no real friends. He basically lived his life by himself. And from what he confessed to the police, he'd seen me on TV and decided that I should be his girlfriend, and in his world, that's what was going to happen. In a way, it was kind of sad. He was charged and convicted with a number of things that I don't feel like running on about in this, but he was placed in a social services facility, and as far as I know, he's still there. I continued to work for the supermarket for another 4 years before deciding to move to the West Coast for another opportunity. Greg and I went our separate ways, and I speak to him from time to time. When all this happened, though, I became a little more famous, not for my television spots for the supermarket, but for all of the reporters and stuff covering the story. Like I said, I have no idea what happened to Mitch, and I don't care. I do know that if he ever gets out, there is a restraining order that he has to follow, and if he violates it, he will go to prison. I'm very happy where I am now. I love living in Silver Lake and have put this chapter of life behind me. My parents never bring it up. My friends never bring it up, and this is the first time that I've brought it up in a long time. When I visit home, though, I'm still a little paranoid. No matter what, every time I go back there, I'm always looking over my shoulder, thinking that I'm going to see that bright smile of Mitch. Hallway Fright, submitted by Mary G. In the mid-'80s, I was working as a nursing assistant at a large nursing home in Fort Worth, Texas on the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. I was on my rounds at the far end of the hall, away from the nurses' station, and had just left the first room of my rounds when my spidey sense kicked in really hard. I had chills from head to toe. The right side of my scalp, shoulder, and arm were nothing but goosebumps. I looked behind me and didn't see anything at first, so I continued up the hall, and when I came out of the next room, there was a thick gray fog, or whatever you want to call it, standing outside that first room I had come out of when my spidey sense kicked in. I couldn't freak out and go running and screaming up the hall because I didn't want to wake up the residents and look like a fool in front of my coworkers. So I finished my rounds, and when I got back to the nurse's station, the nurse on duty, I'll call her Terry, and another aide, Francis, wanted to know why I was shaking and pale. I told them what had happened. Terry said there used to be an old lady in that room who was very hateful and would fight with the employees, slapping and spitting on them. So it wasn't anything to go in that room or be in that hallway and see her spirit. This only happened that one time, but that was enough. Junkies at the Mall, submitted by Paul. I thought I would share this story to see if you'd read it. Back in the 80s, I worked in a record store in our local mall. It was outside of a Sears store, and this odd couple used to come in all the time. I was 19 at the time, and I'm an average-sized guy. There were these homeless-looking people, a guy and a girl, that always hung around the mall, like every day. They would wander through our record store and never buy anything, but would frequently ask us odd questions that we later figured out were to get us workers separated so they could steal. Stuff like, could they use the bathroom and things like that. As most people know, malls have public restrooms, and there would be no need to use a private bathroom if any of the stores actually had private bathrooms in the first place. To my knowledge, we didn't have anything like that. We had a back room and a hallway that was connected to other stores through their back rooms, but that was about it. If I wanted to take a piss, I had to go to the public restroom. One night, I was working, and it was getting close to closing, which was 9 p.m. back then. The couple had come in and was wandering around the store looking through records and tapes, and again, not buying anything, but asking weird questions. My coworker Dave was talking with the woman when she had some specific request about a record that I can't recall. He walked away with her to the section where that record would have been, while I was just doing store maintenance, fixing up the stacks, etc. With my back turned to the guy, I didn't notice that he was grabbing a bunch of tapes and stuffing them into his jacket. I was alerted to this by a third employee, a little woman named Danielle, who we called Danny. She was pretty tough and had no trouble confronting people who were out of line in the store. She was making this motion of putting something into her shirt, then I knew exactly what she meant. I nonchalantly walked to another section of the store, acting like I had no idea what he was doing. Danny started to make a move towards the guy, and I started to move towards him as well, so to speak, cut him off at the pass if he tried to make a run out the front of the store. He must have known that the jig was up, because he did start walking quickly to the store entrance. I got up to him and grabbed him by the arm and said, "I don't think so, buddy." Danny had come up and kind of patted his jacket and said, "What do we have in there?" The guy stared at us crazily, and we could tell he was on something. I looked at him and said, "Look, man, normally I'd let you put the stuff back and just tell you not to come back, but this is not your first time doing this in this store. This time I have to call security." He tries to rip away from my grasp, and all of the tapes spill out from his jacket onto the floor. Danny goes to call mall security, as we didn't have police that took care of the mall. They would call the police and let them handle things with us telling them what had happened. So as Danny is making the call, this guy pulls out a buck knife and swings it at me. He catches my forearm and slashes it open, and I was surprised that the knife was as sharp as it was. I mean, this wasn't a scratch on my arm, it was cut. Of course I yelled out and let go, and he took off with his girlfriend in the back of the store screaming for him to come back. Dave was not letting her leave for obvious reasons, and Danny is now freaking out on the phone, telling them that I will also need medical attention. I took my shirt off and wrapped it around my arm and held it tightly, waiting for the help to come. Mall security gets there and starts questioning the girlfriend, realizing she hasn't really done anything that they can run her in for. But they do call the police, who show up to take a statement from me and also arrange for some medical treatment. It wasn't as bad as I originally thought, but I would need stitches, and they asked if I wanted an ambulance. Dave said he would drive me to the ER, and I moaned inside, knowing I was probably going to have to sit there for a couple of hours before they took care of me. That pissed me off more than anything. We gave them the description of the guy, and they told the woman she was no longer allowed in the mall, and if they found either of them there, they would arrest them both for trespassing, and she had better tell her friend that he would be facing charges for attacking me too. I got my arm looked at, and my boss was super cool and told me to take a couple of days off and he wouldn't charge me with vacation time. I look back at that job now and laugh because I think minimum wage was something like $3.18 back then. It's a far cry from the $15 everybody is demanding today. When I did get back to work a couple of days later, I found myself having to take a squirt. I let my coworkers know I'd be right back and went to the public restroom. As I did my thing, I went to wash my hands and then heard the door open. I didn't think anything of it because people come and go from the public restroom all the time. I mean, it was the middle of the day. But when I turned to use the air dryer, I found myself looking into the eyes of the guy who had cut my arm. He was standing there with the same knife open and was looking at me menacingly. He walked forward, kind of slashing the air a little bit, but with this really creepy grin on his face, and he started hissing about really fucking me up this time for getting him kicked out of the mall. I'm not much of a fighter, and never have been, but I knew that I had to do something here. I kept backing up away from him, telling him that he better put the knife down, or he'd be in way more trouble than he already was. But he just kept grinning at me and walking towards me. I remember this like it was yesterday, and I was thinking that I was hoping someone else would walk into the bathroom. In fact, I remember praying to God to have someone walk into the bathroom. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. I was running out of real estate behind me and thought, well, I'm going to have to take care of this on my own. The guy was walking towards me, and I just turned and jumped into a stall and closed and locked the door. Yeah, like that was going to do anything with this nut. He was now standing outside of the door, gently tapping on it, saying that he could wait there all day. I had no idea what to do. The only thing I could think of was to crouch down and see his feet and legs under the bottom of the door. I remember bracing myself on my knees against the toilet and reaching out for his legs. He obviously was not paying attention because he didn't move. And before he knew it, I had my hands around his ankles and pulled with all of my strength back towards me. He fell backwards and cracked his head very loudly on the tiled wall, and I jumped up and unlocked the stall door and made a break for the bathroom exit. When I ran back out into the mall, thank God there were two mall security guys who happened to be walking by, and I told them what had happened, and who was in there, and what he had done in our store, too. They went in and came out with him on either side, holding his arms, and he was going bananas. He lunged at me again and started trying to kick out at me, and they were having a heck of a time keeping him under control. I did see a little bit of blood on the back of his head as they took him away, and said that they would be coming to my store with the police and not to leave the mall. So, in a way, I kind of felt good that I did get a shot at him and return the favor of him cutting me with the knife. It turns out that he and his girlfriend were junkies and were always getting into trouble, not just at our mall. They were living a life of stealing shit to sell to keep their habits rolling, and basically were fried almost all of the time. No love lost with me. I was glad to see them both go. Total scumbags. I have a nifty scar on my forearm that will never be going away and that will always remind me about the time I had to fight back in a public restroom. I've never been in a fight since, and I don't think I'll ever find myself in a position like that again. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. Next week, during the last 2 for Tuesday, I will be announcing the winner of the t-shirt contest. The winner needs to contact me via email and let me know what design they would like and what size. If you haven't already, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel, and I'd like to thank the new members of the Campfire crew. I just passed 10,000 subscribers, and that's really cool, a nice milestone for me. This episode contains some short stories and some rather long ones, and I know that irritates different people. Some people like the short ones, some people hate the long ones, and vice versa. But my policy is to read everything that people send me. If you have taken the time to write out your scary story, who am I to not put it on the channel? If you do have a scary story you'd like to hear me narrate, email unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. And of course, follow me on social media. Links to all of that are in the description below. Everyone, be excellent to each other and enjoy this Labor Day weekend. Until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.